Smile, every hug, every kiss, every touch, every person in my life that I care about and love. But wait, maybe I'm getting too emotional. That's exactly what they say you ain't supposed to do. Suppress your feelings, never talk about your pain. Can't appreciate the sun without acknowledging it rains, right? That's right. So this a moment of clarity. And make sure you always protect your energy. You stay focused and your life gon' be lit. And you are now rocking with Celeste, the therapist. Let's go.
Hi, beautiful people. If you've never been into my podcast before, my name is Celeste. I'm a therapist from Boston. I come on, I talk to people who are doing things to empower the lives of others by sharing their story. So I've been podcasting since July 2018. It's coming up on three years. And this is episode 283, which is so exciting. And we are currently streaming on Facebook, Periscope, and YouTube. So if you are watching this on the video platform, this is actually an audio podcast that is streaming in over 130 countries. So I'm really excited about that. So many people have learned how to shift the way they think by hearing people's stories. I have this like weird way of being able to make it make sense and connect people and connect the dots. So I'm excited about that. So I'm going to bring on my special guest to the stream, who is not new to StreamYard because he speaks literally everywhere. Hi, David. How are you? Can you introduce yourself to my audience?
Yeah, good evening, everybody. I was saying to Celeste ahead of time, I'm so impressed that this is her 200 and something episode. I feel like everybody's starting a podcast, they make it to like 2 or 3, but 200 and almost like pushing 300 is amazing. So I'm here in Chicago, south side of Chicago, snowing buckets right now, which it's been doing on and off for a few days. It's supposed to get to like 8 degrees this weekend. So that's our life.
That sounds fun.
Yeah, it's something. Well, I got an 11-year-old and a 6-year-old, and they are so excited, so happy. So, so I'm a little bit happy as well.
Oh, that's good. Well, thank you for being here. So one of the things that I do want to talk about your book. We're going to go into your book. So David has a book called Rediscipling the White Church, which I listened to on Audibles. So I'm excited to kind of get into that. But before I, talk about what you're doing, I'd like to kind of give people a little bit of a background on where my guest comes from. So you're a pastor currently. Did you know you were always going to be a pastor?
No, I grew up in a Christian family for sure. I actually grew up in Venezuela and Ecuador. My parents were missionaries. My dad was a pilot, flew little airplanes around sort of, more difficult to access areas. And so I actually grew up loving Jesus, loving ministry. But pastoring, church stuff, not so much. It wasn't where the action was. And so, I was like, it's fine. Church was fine, but it wasn't exciting. If you wanted to, live a life of significance or meaning, church was probably not going to be the place to do that. So it really wasn't until I went to graduate school, Wheaton Graduate School out here outside of Chicago, that God really started to change some stuff for me. It was through some classes. It was through the local church we were attending, where I kind of saw pastoral ministry up close in a way that was very compelling to me. And I remember, telling my wife, like, I don't know, there's something going on here. And she did not marry a pastor.
No, we're not about to do this.
It was not. We had not had that conversation ahead of time. So it took both of us a little while, and for me, it was a very, very slow, gradual, process. And now I wouldn't, I'm so thankful I get to be a pastor, would not want to do anything else.
So you grew up in Venezuela. What was that like for you? Your parents were not from there, right? They came there and you stayed for a number of years. What was that like for you being in Venezuela?
Yeah, I mean, so our family moved to Venezuela when I was 2 years old, so I didn't know anything different. That was just normal, right? I didn't have anything to compare it to, and it was great. It was a wonderful place to grow up. Good friends. Very thankful, frankly, that was my childhood. Was there for 9 years, and then another couple of years in Quito, Ecuador, before we moved back to Southern California. So really, all my kind of really formational years up until entering high school. And It's one of those things it's almost hard to describe because it was just all I knew. And
Mhm.
I see in hindsight how it was pretty significant in my life, those years, and probably how those years helped me maybe to see things a little bit differently than I would have otherwise. But at the time, it was just life, our family, our neighbors, just living and being a kid growing up in that kind of environment.
So now you go to school, you decide you're going to become a pastor. Now you start, you're in a church initially where everyone looked like you, right? There was all white people, no Black people.
Mm-hmm.
What was that experience like for you?
Yeah, so the church that my wife and I started attending is actually some friends. We moved from North Carolina to the suburbs of Chicago for graduate school. First Saturday that we moved, we were going to garage sales because we literally had nothing. We had a mattress and that was it. So we're like, we gotta have some chairs to eat on at least. And some people at a garage sale invited us to their church, and we went to their church and loved it, and we just stuck. And you're right. The kind of the suburbs we were in, majority white. This church as well, majority white. Though did have some racial ethnic diversity and a lot of socioeconomic diversity, which was a little rare in that particular suburb. And that church was really significant in my call to ministry. The pastor was so down to earth, spent a lot of time with me, and so that church actually brought me on as an associate pastor after graduate school. And those were 5 amazing years. I remain so grateful for those years. But it was really the kind of mono racial nature of that suburban experience that was challenging for me. And I could just never feel at home. And so we spent a lot of time in the city, spent a lot of time with our friends on the south side of the city and other diverse neighborhoods in the city. And that's where I felt just a little bit more coming alive and like, I can imagine being here a long, long time. Learned about a multiracial church in the city and kind of started tracking with them a little bit. Long story short, they eventually called me as an associate pastor. And so we moved from the suburbs, monoracial, up to the north side of Chicago, a fairly diverse community, and was at that church for just 18 months before they sent us out to start the church on the south side where we're at now.
Oh, okay. And I'm assuming your lack of not feeling as comfortable or feeling called to more was because of your upbringing, growing up with a more diverse kind of group of people.
I think that's probably right. Yeah, I think it was a couple things. I think it was that for sure. Just this desire to be in spaces, communities that were more culturally diverse, less homogenous. I think as well, I if I'm totally honest with you, I struggled with it. It was a very affluent community, and that was pretty new to me. I had never lived in a community like that, and I struggle with that. Like I realized that discipleship in that kind of community had its own challenges. How do you follow Jesus in the midst of so much wealth? And I didn't know if I could do it. I didn't know if I was a good enough Christian, to follow Jesus in that kind of affluence. So I'm being a little tongue in cheek, but that was also, I think, a part of, sort of how God moved us, elsewhere was some of those experiences.
Wow, your upbringing really shaped your mindset around what you see. I think people that have kind of been in that kind of like higher socioeconomic status, that would have been fine because that's what people have known. But because it's not something that you've always been accustomed to, it just felt different. So now you are called to kind of do your own church. You were intentional about creating the way you created the church. Can you talk to people about that and how, like, what led you to become intentional about creating a multiracial church?
Yeah. So when we moved from the suburbs to the church in the city, the big attractions for me personally were that this was in the city, this was an intentionally multiracial church, and they wanted to start other churches, and all 3 of those were very exciting to me. So when this church started to think about sending some folks to start a new church, we knew right away this was going to be a multiracial congregation because it was coming from this multiracial church. And this church had this understanding, this belief that in a segregated city like Chicago, which if your listeners or viewers aren't aware, Chicago remains one of our most segregated cities in this country. A multiracial church has the chance to really stand out and to bear witness to the gospel in some pretty unique ways. And so we gathered some folks from that church, and then we started introducing ourselves to other people in the community, in the neighborhood, so that by the time that we were ready to start, we had a small team of people that in many ways represented the demographics of the church today. We're about a third Black, a third Asian American, a third white, and that's more or less how we started in those early days. And so from the very beginning, we had a diversity in our leadership, on our worship team, on our preaching team, around the leadership table. So we've had the great gift of always being able to live into that vision of reconciliation. Whereas I know a lot of churches or other organizations even are trying to make a change, right? They've only been white led. They've only had white people making the financial decisions or whatever, and they're trying to make that change, which is very admirable, but it's also, that's some difficult work. We had the great gift of getting to start that way.
That's really good. And so you started that way. It was very intentional. Life is going. Then something changes for you. You talk a little bit about in your book around thinking about some thoughts you had around racism. And I believe that was when you kind of started, this book process. When you had the sidewalk done, and then, what year was that? And, what did that feel like to kind of come to, because you're in a multiracial church and you're doing everything, it seems like the right way, but there is these implicit biases that you had to come to grips with. What was that like for you when you had that aha moment?
Yeah. So I would say there's kind of a couple things here, and in the book I write about one particular moment where I had kind of patched up some sidewalk in front of our apartment, and then was reading on our couch, which just overlooks our front window out onto that same sidewalk, and I heard someone kind of tearing through my tape and stomping through my cement. And where our apartment is, there's a public high school a few blocks away, and a private prestigious university a few blocks in the different direction. And so immediately an image of who's stomping through my cement comes to mind. And in my head, I see a young Black high school student, male, stomping through my cement. I jump up, run to the window, and of course, who is it? It's a young white student from that, prestigious university. And certainly I've had lots of those moments, over the years where that implicit bias kind of makes itself very visible, and I'm very, very aware of it. And so I think that I was trying to tell that story in the book as just a way to say that came from somewhere, right? That I didn't sit there and okay, what am I going to picture? Who am I going to imagine? It wasn't rational, right? It snaps into my imagination. And the question is, well, where does that come from? And why was that the image and not that the white, college student, the image that came to my mind? That's related to kind of the process of writing the book, in that I started, for about 10 years, I had only been thinking about multiracial churches and doing work in these kind of diverse spaces. And then in the kind of lead up and aftermath of the last presidential election, the 2016 election, I started to think about discipleship in white churches, and discipleship that was leaving white people content in their racial segregation and their complicity with racism and racial injustice. And it was a similar question, right? Where does that come from? In the same way as, where did that implicit bias pop up in me? Where did that come from? I was starting to ask questions about the discipleship that was forming white people into certain assumptions and imaginations that would lead them to supporting a president who was so troubling to so many Christians of color in this country, and yet there seemed to be such a disconnect there, and so that's what got me pushing into the book project.
And so just for my listeners, because I have a really diverse group of people that listen, you kind of define discipleship as following Jesus in order to become like Jesus, to do what Jesus does in the world. Is that fair to say when
Yeah.
we think about discipleship? And then when people, regardless of whether or not people are Christians, I think Jesus is looked at as like the ultimate person to follow, who was with the sick, was with, like, he just was with so many different people. Can you talk to my listeners a little bit about your perspective on how we went from, following Jesus? Because you think about the disciples in the Bible and how he asks us to leave. He asks them to leave what they're doing and follow me. So what do you think changed that now we're not renewing our mind and our spirit, and we are becoming so much of the world, and in the church? I mean, and specifically with,
Exactly.
some white people in the church. Does that make sense? Does that question make sense?
Absolutely. No. Well, you tell me. I'm going to try to answer, and if I'm not getting your question right, just redirect me. But yeah, I mean, if I'm hearing you correctly, it's a question of like those early disciples. They realized that following Jesus required leaving so much behind. It required a complete transformation, and they get that over time. Time and time again, they realize, oh man, this following Jesus thing, I got to be all in, and I'm going to have to look different than who I used to be. And in so many of our white churches today, we would still say that following Jesus requires this complete transformation. But what that usually means is an interior transformation, or it may mean avoiding a couple of our chosen sins, whatever those top sins are in any particular tradition, right? But what it hasn't meant is that we need to stop conforming to the pattern of this world, which is the language that Paul uses in his letter to the church in Rome. And this is important, I think, because those early Christians, they pretty quickly realized that the things that we took for granted before, we can't take for granted anymore. The things that were just normal and neutral before are no longer normal and neutral. And we see this being played out in the Gospels and in the book of Acts and in the epistles. There's this constant tension, this constant kind of waking up to like, okay, this really is a different way to live. And unfortunately, in my experience, when it comes to race, this is one of those patterns that we have conformed to as white Christians. We have not seen that following Jesus requires leaving behind those old patterns, those old assumptions. And so what we've done is we have conformed ourselves to those patterns, and we've brought those patterns right with us into our churches. So there's this status quo, a racialized status quo, a racialized hierarchical status quo. And because white churches have not identified this as being opposed to the gospel, we bring it right with us into our churches. We leave that status quo undisturbed, and we leave ourselves content in that sin. And that's the real kind of troubling and heartbreaking thing to me.
Yeah, that's so good. And one of the things you talk about is how a lot of white Christians don't necessarily identify, or they're not like their Christians of color. They're more like other white people. They feel more conformed. And the book is really great. So if this is interesting, you definitely get the book. But one of the things you talk about is how white children internalize race and actively ignore it, and how Black children, we have to be taught about race because of everything that's happening around us. Talk to people a little bit about how like the upbringing and just the systems in America kind of shapes their ideas around race. Jane Elliott is somebody who's talked about this for years, and says like if you went to school in America, like there's going to be some racist thoughts because of the way that the system is shaped.
Yeah. I've sometimes heard white adults say, well, the issues around race are going to get better because this younger generation, they just get it more. And I think that's just way too optimistic. And as a Christian, I would say that's just not how sin works. Sin doesn't just magically get better generation by generation. And so I love that you're asking that question, because that chapter about children was very, very important to me, to think about, well, what would it look like to be more actively participating in the discipleship of our children? So one of the things I get to do in non-COVID times is to facilitate these cross-racial long weekend trips with pastors and other Christians. And one of the questions that we ask people initially is, when did you first realize that race matters? And for the white people, it's quite late in life, late high school, early college, maybe could be even later. For the people of color, and for the Black people in particular, it's very early, 4, 5, 6 years old. And it's generally because a caretaker, a parent, grandparent, aunt, uncle sat down and had a conversation with that child about why race matters. And this is born, in my understanding, out of two instincts. The first instinct is very pragmatic. This caring adult realizes that this child could be facing very dangerous circumstances in a racialized country. And so they need to prepare this child to protect themselves, to avoid those dangerous circumstances whenever possible. But there's another instinct here that really gets at the discipleship piece, which is that these caregivers understand that this child is going to be lied to about their value, about their identity. And this could be very direct, and it could be very subtle, but that there are going to be these messages that are sent to this child about who is most valuable and who is least valuable. And so this loving parent is having a preemptive conversation to say, when that happens, don't believe that lie. When that happens, remember who you are, remember whose you are. That's discipleship. They are discipling the child in that moment. The problem for white parents is that because we don't have that first reality, we don't perceive there to be a threat or a danger to our child, we don't have the conversation at all. So we never have the discipleship conversation. We never say to that white child the same thing that Black parent says to their child, which is, you will also be lied to. You will also be told lies about who is most important in this country and who is least important in this country. You will also be lied to about who fits where in the status quo of this country. And so rather than discipling our white children, we abandon them to the racial discipleship of the secular society. And that's a tragedy. And it doesn't have to be that way. That's not inevitable. There's no reason that white Christian parents could not learn from Black Christian parents. What does it look like to sit down and have this difficult and tender conversation with our children? How do we disciple them? How do we tell them the truth? How do we pay attention to when they are being lied to and intervene in those key moments? That could absolutely happen within the body of Christ. But segregation has meant that we're not even proximate to one another to be able to have those conversations. So
Hold on, David. You froze on us. I'm gonna wait till he comes. Right when he was getting to the meat of it. Let me see. If you can hear me, David, you're frozen. Restart him? Okay, let me see. I'm gonna restart. He's probably gonna come back on. He probably is gonna come back on. So if you're watching me live, I'm talking to Dave Swanson. He has a book called Rediscipling the White Church. And he just froze. So I'm gonna wait for him to come log back in. But right now we're talking about children and how the difference with the white children I know, it's so interesting. I'm mad that it froze on us. The difference with white children being brought up in America and Black children, um, and how Black kids have to learn about their race prior to becoming an adult. So I'm going to wait for him to come back because this is good. If you guys have any questions, just let me know because I can ask him. I read his book. It's really good. I didn't realize I'm not on the screen. Hold on. Oh, he's back. Okay. I was like, David, you are getting to the meat of it and you just like cut off on me. It's like, is that the devil? That's what Christians would say. That's the devil.
That's right.
It's the internet. It's the Chicago weather.
It is. I'm so sorry about that.
It's okay. So you left off at the black children are taught early on, and that's a tragedy because there's opportunity for us to learn together.
Right. And this is why I think the multiracial church is still so compelling to me, that there is the possibility for a new way of living out our faith together. There is a possibility for what we can learn from one another, for how iron can sharpen iron in this particular kind of way. Mm-hmm. Now, there's all kinds of reasons why the multiracial church is difficult and hard, and the challenges that we need to address there, but it does remain a very hopeful possibility for me.
So, one of the things, unfortunately, I'm sure what you're doing is not the norm for a white preacher to do. Someone said that they liked you better when you were just quoting scriptures. And I think that white people have been struggling with what's going on, even though it's in their face, because of what you talk about in the book, examples of camp having white leaders. A lot of white people have not been led by other Black people, whether it's in school teaching them or whether it's serving them in the ministry. Can you tell people how that kind of messes? Now, we talked about the kids, right? How it starts there, but now even as we become older, we don't still see a lot of Black people in leadership. And so as a white person, they don't understand how much they are internalizing that, Black is below and white is above, how that plays a role in mindset.
One of the places I see that dynamic that you're describing is in a white church that invites the Black preacher to come on MLK Sunday and no other time. And
I was cracking up when I listened to that part.
And just invite your Black pastor friend to come preach. I don't know, in September sometime, and just whatever the Lord gives them to preach about, just preach. But that's how this stuff works, right? It works on the level of the imagination, where we think that okay, I'm going to talk about race, so I got to get a preacher of color to preach about that thing and tell them what they're going to preach about. But then all of the normal stuff, all of the regular Bible stuff, all of the regular theology stuff, well, that's going to be, that's going to be a white person in the pulpit for that. So yeah, I think there's all kinds of ways. And when I was writing the chapter on communion, I was thinking how many white Christians have been led to the Lord's Supper by people of color? How many of them have had the words of institution at this most holy and sacred moment led by a person of color? How many have been actually served the body and the blood with hands that do not look like their own hands? And I'm guessing it's actually quite a few who've never even had that experience. And so this is the world that we live in, right? We live in a world where the average white Christian is going to say, well, of course I'm not racist. I don't think racist things. I don't do racist things. And it's almost as though we've inoculated ourselves from actually seeing the truth and all of the far more subtle ways that race continues to exhibit so much shaping force in our worlds, organizing force in our worlds. Now, once you start to see it, you can't not see it. Once you start to go whoa, my life is incredibly segregated, or I only read white theologians, as a pastor, then it's hard to not see it. But a lot of the work that I think we do with white Christians is getting them to that point where they're actually able to see it, to let their defensive down long enough they can see it.
One of the things I do a class, Healing the Inner Child, and I talk a lot about the importance of really acknowledging what you're feeling, what you went through. And I think about white people and the idea to have emotional maturity and really having to accept that that's a grieving process, that has to happen. And I think that when you say once you see it, you can't unsee it, I think that's why so many people like shy away from really trying to see it, even though it's in our face. Do you think that that's the case? It's a lot like not wanting to like really feel those hard feelings that they're going to have to feel.
Yeah, I do. I absolutely do. And you're going to be smarter on this than I am. So maybe I'll say something and you can, fill in a little bit of this. But I think that one of the metaphors for whiteness is spiritual and emotional immaturity. Mm-hmm. I really think that that like meeting white people where we are means reckoning with some significant spiritual and emotional immaturity. We have been willfully kept from the truth. And so when we're confronted with the truth, we don't have enough emotional or spiritual depth to handle that. And so we deny, mm-hmm. we get defensive, mm-hmm. we deflect, rather than saying, and I'm talking about conversation between Christians, mm-hmm. I am so sorry that has happened. I am so sorry that I didn't know about that. I'm so sorry for my participation, right? Like rather than having that move toward empathetically, mm-hmm. the immaturity pulls us back. Mm-hmm. And so I think, Celeste, that a lot of this discipleship that I'm thinking about does have to get at that level of maturity and helping people to start growing up emotionally mm-hmm. and spiritually. So I don't know. I'm guessing you have more wisdom about that than I do.
No, I mean that sounds pretty accurate. And I think, you can't force people to have enlightening moments, which is kind of hard when you're suffering. And, I think what makes it even harder for me to grapple with, which is why like I was drawn to your book, is white Christians, like you say Christians and you think about what a Christian is and how much they drove this 2016 election with our current, the previous president. And, I say that, Trump becoming president allowed us to see what is really happening. He didn't create racism. Right. He just allowed people to become more comfortable with it. Mm. And I think one of the things about your book is that there's this sense of hope for change that comes with it. I feel like there's a way for it to happen. How do you see that for white people being able to kind of change? Because now I feel like there's so much exposure that's taken place. And like you said, it's hard to create multiracial churches and just kind of like this conformity of real discipleship, mm-hmm. like Jesus talked about. How do you see that change happening? Because you clearly have hope for change, or you would not have written the book.
Well, let me say a word about hope, and then let me talk about change. Okay. My hope, my hope really is in Jesus, and I don't say that flippantly. What I mean by that is that my hope resides in a Savior who was crucified, resurrected, and then ascended to the right hand of the Father, and whose resurrection assures us that he will return and make all things new. Mm-hmm. That is my hope. And I believe that hope of Jesus returning reaches into our present moment, right? So I don't mean to get too preachy, but I'm really Christian about this. Like, I don't know where to find hope outside of that. Like circumstantially, I don't know where to find hope outside of that.
Right.
But if that's true, then how I experience my circumstances change. I see them different.
Yeah.
So I want to say that very, very clearly. When it comes to my hope in white Christians, it's pretty low, to be frank with you. I'm pleasantly surprised, pretty regularly, which is great. I love that. Have conversations with white pastors regularly these days. We're like, I want to be about it. I want to get to this. I'm like, great. Well, let's check in again 10 years and see how it's going. But I'm with you right now. If you want it, like, let's do this. As it relates to change, and I'd be curious what you think about this. I think that one of the mistakes that we have made in the West, and particularly white people, is that we reduce human beings to brains. And so we think that if we just engage your intellect, then we'll get you to change. If I can change your mind, then I'm going to change how you live. And our minds are very important, and we absolutely have to kind of retrain our thoughts. But we are embodied creatures. And so any form of discipleship that does not account for loves, desires, imaginations, assumptions, fears is going to leave us stuck. Because the fact of the matter is that I don't move through my day one thought after the next. I don't rationalize my way through the day. I love my way through the day. I desire my way through the day, right? Mm-hmm. I'm an emotional creature. And I say this as someone who thinks a lot. I'm still a very emotional creature. And we all are. That's what it means to be human. Yeah. And so we need to think about change as it relates to how our desires reoriented, how our loves redirected. If my desires are leading me into a segregated life, if my desires are leading me into a contentment with racial injustice and systemic racism, then those loves and those desires, they need to be redirected. How do we do that? And what I try to say in the book is that what Christians have always said is that it has to do with changing our habits. That our habits are the things that direct our loves and our desires. So how do we change our habits? We practice. We practice. There's nothing unique about this. But Christians have been doing this forever. We come together in worship and we practice. And in practicing, our habits change, our loves and our desires grow more fully into what God intended for them. And so when we worship, when we serve, when we disciple our children, we're practicing. When it comes to white Christians, our practice has just been too thin. It's just been too shallow. We've not fully been practicing. We've not been living into who God has actually called us to be. So that's where I think change can actually happen. We just have to reckon with the fullness of our humanity.
Yeah, that's really good. And the idea of habits and practicing, our habits are, we're products of our environment. And I think once we have that aha moment, we really have to be in communion and involved. And I get what you're saying. It's not just like, let me read this. And I tell people, you can't argue with people that have these fixed ideas. They have to be in communion with you to understand. You can't understand if you're not in communion. You would never understand what I'm dealing with. One of the things that you did after, I believe, the Mike Brown shooting, or Eric Garner, after Eric Garner, you kind of walked the streets with another church and laid down in solidarity. What was that experience like? You talked about just how passionate you noticed the Black church or Black people are around this, community, standing together in solidarity with people when we're experiencing injustice. And you had so many awakening moments in this book, but that one kind of stood out for me. I'm curious about what that experience was like for you. If you could just tell people about what I'm talking about.
Yeah, certainly. Protest here in Chicago is very common. There's a kind of long history of that, and churches protesting. There's a long history of that, and so I'm blessed, and our church is blessed to be in relationship with pastors and churches in our community that, when necessary, are very willing to take to the streets. And so that's been something that we've done together a few times over the course of our 10 years. In this particular case, there was just at this moment where it just felt like this barrage of these instances of police brutality and young Black, usually men, killed, murdered, and there was such a heaviness. And so one of the pastors in our neighborhood said, "Listen, our city needs to see that the church is in this." And so he called us to, after our worship services, to walk out of our sanctuaries, to meet together in the streets for this march, and then this at this very busy intersection, we all would lay down in this kind of die-in action. And so there was a couple things that were really significant about that for me. One was the idea that all of these churches on that Sunday, they worshiped, they preached the gospel. Most of them probably had altar calls, right? Like they did church in the way that many, many, many white Christians would be very familiar with. And maybe some of the stylistic things were different, right? But all of the orthodox biblical stuff, done. And then everybody gets up, walks out the building, into the street for a march. And I thought, that's discipleship, right? These women and men have been discipled to understand the proclamation of the gospel with the participation in the pursuit of justice as being part and parcel of what it means to follow Jesus. Whereas most white Christians have been told you got to choose one or the other. Yeah. You can have Jesus or you can have justice, but you can't have both. And that's the implications of our discipleship. And so I was just so grateful for that very vivid example of that. The other thing is, there's a majority African-American community. And so the crowd that day on that march was mostly Black churches, Black Christians, and then our little multiracial church participating. And we were just part of it, right? We were just welcomed into that marching congregation on that day of protest. The way that white people perceive race as being this gate that keeps people apart is not always how it's experienced, for me at least, in our work in our particular community. If you show up in good faith and solidarity, then we got a place for you, and there's some work to be done, and let's get about it. Let's do this work together. This kind of open-hearted hospitality towards somebody like me who could be viewed as antagonistic, as unhelpful, as symbolizing some really problematic aspects of our collective history, is instead welcomed into this family and into this work together. That's the church. That to me is the heart of Jesus, is this kind of hospitality to proclaim the gospel and then to live it out in this way that cannot be explained away.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so many profound. If we keep talking about everything in the book that I enjoyed, I think we'll be here forever. But one of the things that stood out, the thing that stood out for me is all of the stories you've heard. The boy, the woman who said that her son wanted to take off his skin. He didn't want to be Black anymore because, Black men are dying. And what do you do to take care of yourself as you're hearing all of these stories? And not only are you compassionate and listening to people of color, but I'm sure you're getting, people that, I researched my guests before, and I just some of the talks and stuff, and you're radical or you're not a real Christian. How do you take care of yourself when you're trying to balance so many extremes?
Such a good therapist question to ask.
I can't say I gotta do it, David. I'm sorry.
No, I love that question. I've been thinking about that question a lot, and actually, anytime that I'm with, people who are doing this work, I try to bring this up. One of my mentors in this reconciliation work said to me probably 11 or 12 years ago, she said, I can count the number of my friends and colleagues who are dead, and not out of the work, but literally, dead. And her point was, you have to take seriously the toll that justice and reconciliation work can take. Whenever I say that, I like to be very clear that the toll is different, right? Like the pushback that I receive as a white man in this work is very different than many of my friends and colleagues who are Black, and particularly Black women. Is next level, the kind of vitriol that they will face in these diverse and white spaces. And so I think it's always important to say that out loud. The cost is not borne equally in this work at all. And we do need to prioritize our own health and well-being. So I'm a huge proponent for Sabbath keeping. I think that a weekly Sabbath day that is reserved for worship and rest, play, is essential. It's something my wife and I have practiced for probably about 15 years now. We try not to do anything productive on our Sabbath day. It is a truly a day for rest. It's a day that allows me to kind of get in touch with my sadness, with those places in my own heart that feel broken, after the previous 6 days. And I need to, right? Like I need to feel that. I need to be aware of that. I can't just gloss over those things. Having good mentors has been really important. I've had the same spiritual director for 12, 13 years. A woman in our neighborhood here, grew up in our neighborhood. I was with her yesterday online. So things like that for me have been really, really essential. And being okay prioritizing that stuff too, right? Like there's this sense of there's always so much urgent to do, and the work can feel so important. And this is not like theoretical stuff. This is people's lives, and well-beings that we're talking about. But I have to remember that there's only one God, and I am not that God. And so my act of rest and stopping is an act of worship. It's an act of saying, I'm aware that anything good that I accomplish is because God has done this through me. And so I can stop and I can rest.
Good. I love that. And he talks about the Sabbath, all this stuff is literally in the book. I feel like I'm re-listening to the book. So he definitely talks about this in the book for people that are finding themselves inspired by this idea of rest. Because, I have people that may be doing the work that you're doing, and I think this is needed. And the last thing I want to ask you is, because my goal on my podcast is to help people shift the way they think. And sometimes, some people's stories may help people. And so if there's somebody listening, like a white person listening and feeling inspired by this idea of, maybe I need to look at my biases, or maybe I need to work through some things I never really thought about. Besides getting the book, what would you tell them they should think about doing? Like what kind of actionable step could they take today?
Just one.
Oh, no. You can do, you're a pastor. Y'all got more than one thing to say. So
a few of them. Well, here's the first thing I would say, again, because we're talking about our loves and our imaginations, right? I will only do something for a certain amount of time because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like I'll go to the gym for a while because it's the right thing to do. But if something doesn't click at some point and I actually start enjoying it, I'm probably not going to last. And so I think it's important to say to that person who's maybe earlier on in the journey that this is just better. Like it's just a better way to live. And there are going to be so many moments of sacrifice. It's going to feel like you're losing so much. You're going to feel confused. You're going to be confronted with aspects of your history and our shared history that you didn't know about, that you didn't learn about in school. Your understanding of the nature of our country is going to change. Your understanding of the white church in this country. There's going to be all sorts of these hard moments. But I'm here to say that it's so much better. And that once you have begun to live into the reconciliation of the people of God, once you're able to start living into the diverse relationships and friendships, peers and mentors and colleagues, there's just no going back. You begin to experience what God had in mind for us a unity that bears witness to the Father's love for the world. That's God's intention for us. And so, Celeste, you were talking about the pushback, which is very true. There is pushback. But for me personally, it has paled in comparison to the abundance of God that I've experienced in this work in very tangible ways through lived friendships and experiences with people. So I want to put that in front of somebody, that the disequilibrium that you'll experience, the confusion, the pushback, the pain, all true. But on the other side of that is something that is so, so good. And this is because our God is so good, right? This is God's idea. Then of course it's going to be good. It's going to be amazing because that's what God is like. So yeah, maybe we are initially compelled because we realize this is right. This is righteous. I have to move in this direction. But because you are a fully embodied human being, it will not end there. Your heart will be captivated. Your emotions and desires will be captivated as well.
Oh, that was good. I could speak to you literally all day. So David is on Instagram. He puts up these like really thought-provoking statements that can really help you shift your mindset. He also, his website, tell people where they can find you and your book, actually.
Yeah, the website is just dwswanson.com, and all the social links. I do try to do a newsletter that goes out every couple of weeks. All that stuff links right there. And the book is everywhere. Amazon, of course, or if you want to get it from your indie bookshop, it's everywhere. There's an audio version, ebook version.
I know. I wish it was you reading it, but I know it's a lot of work to read.
Yeah. Couldn't pull that one off.
But it was good. And every now and then he does talks. He'll talk, and this is what you get when he's talking. Really compassionate. You're very authentic, and you're definitely leading by your heart. So I'm just grateful to have you on. And I appreciate you.
Thank you, Celeste. Yeah, likewise, for real.
All right. So somebody's looking it up right now. Good. So thank you, David, for coming on. For people watching this is going to be on audio tonight, so you'll be able to have it in your pocket, share it with a friend. But I appreciate you, David.
Yeah, and if I can just say thank you for what you're doing too. I think that, man, I mean, the amount of sort of mental and emotional stress right now that we're all carrying, it's a lot, right? And it's kind of unprecedented for many of us. Mm-hmm. And so I think, so many of us right now are just, we feel like we're kind of like just grasping in the dark for what does it look like to live healthy lives right now. And so, what you're doing here in your work is, I think is super, super necessary and super, super important, because it's not like everything, right? But you do have wisdom, right? And you do have gifts that you're sharing through this that are kind of giving people handholds to keep our footing right now, to pay attention to where God is present right now. So, it's really important. So, thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate those words. I receive it. I hope you have a good night, David.
Thank you. Thanks again for having me.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
So that was good. That was David Swanson. You can definitely find his everything on his website. The book is really, really good. I listened to it in a couple of days because it was so good I couldn't stop listening to it. So, and you can find it literally everywhere. So thank you guys so much for listening. We'll be back on Monday with a new episode, talking to somebody that's empowering other people. If you want to check out the podcast, it literally looks like this, Celeste the Therapist Podcast. And again, the goal is to help you shift the way you think. And I've been able to do that through talking to other people. So thank you guys so much. We'll talk to you later.
Smile, every hug, every kiss, every touch, every person in my life that I care about and love. But wait, maybe I'm getting too emotional. That's exactly what they say you ain't supposed to do. Suppress your feelings, never talk about your pain. Can't appreciate the sun without acknowledging it